All right, this is According to Callus. This is going to be part 3 of Vodi Bakum Jr.'s response to CRT, intersectionalism, and various other things called fault lines. We're going to pick up at Chapter 8. Chapter 8. And the subtitle is The Social Justice Movement. And, I'm really kind of falling on my face, aren't I? Yeah, well. Social Justice Movement and Evangelicalism's Looming Catastrophe. Yes, and that was released this year, I might add. So, Chapter 8 starts out titled The Damage. He basically starts with the Trans-American Pyramid in San Francisco versus what happened in Haiti, right? And all the damage and not damage. And talks about different ways to understand that and the vulnerability versus being built to withstand it. And he gets into examples of internalized oppression. And there's a book called Everyone Really Equal? With a question mark. And basically this is a textbook that's supposed to train future educators. Now, apparently I missed out on this when I was taking my education courses, and quite frankly I'm glad I did, because just from the brief highlights here, I could see that I would have had some major struggles not pushing back. But the one of the things I found most interesting is the last one that he's got referenced here. Is believing your struggles with social institutions are a result of your inadequacy rather than a result of unequally distributed resources between dominant and minoritized groups. Talk about a mouthful. Now, if I don't win a prize, it's because I didn't deliver the goods. If I didn't win a race, it's because I'm slow. If I didn't get a high enough score on the SAT, it's because I wasn't able to score that high on the SAT. If I didn't get the job, I would like to believe it's because somebody better equipped to do that job got it instead of me. If I don't do a radio show ever, it's probably because I keep falling all over my words and not taking good enough notes to stay on track. But as they say, this is still a learning curve. So, and then harshly criticizing members of your own group who do not assimilate to dominant norms. So, you want to be successful in a culture, but you refuse to assimilate to those dominant culture norms, and then you want to blame the dominant culture for not accepting the fact that you won't assimilate? I'm pretty sure that doesn't work anywhere else in the world except for maybe parts of Europe that are further gone than we are in our country. When you move to a country, whether you were born there or your parents took you there when you were a child, or in the case of some of these folks, you are forcibly exported and thus imported into a foreign culture, the result is still the same. There's a certain expectation that if you're going to join the society at large, that you're going to become part of it. Now, you can choose to isolate yourself and stay in a tight little knit community, aka ghetto. I mean, the Amish do it, the Orthodox Jews do it, particularly in New York. There's plenty of examples of that with barrios and other black ghettos. I mean, even going to Chinatowns, right? So, I mean, you can do that, but it's a challenge to become successful in the society as a whole if you don't understand that there's a certain expectation. And as I mentioned on my podcast, that does feed into the pride and misplaced pride that I tried to demonstrate is ultimately was the precipitous occasion of the Tulsa massacre, right? So I'm sympathetic and I understand that if you're different, you want to be able to hold on to your difference, but there's also a certain expectation that you bend to the will of the majority, which is, strangely enough, why all this stuff is going on, is they're trying to bend the will of the majority to force those of us that don't comply to comply. I think Brian McClanahan calls it Yankee or puritanical thought process, but we'll save that for another time. Basically talks about anything less than anti-racism is racism. There's some glaring problems, right, that he references with this scenario of anything less than anti-racist is racist, right? He does. Then I'm going to give you just a couple of these subheadings that follow up. Circular question begging logic. Or circular question begging logic. People don't say things because they believe others might find them offensive, and they self-monitor themselves. They don't say anything. And then he gives several examples of people that paid a price. And then we have research that needs to be undone, right? So references the book Human Diversity by Charles Murray and the orthodoxy that is utilized in social science and this particularly understanding of human equality. And he says, and I don't mean equality in the sense of America's traditional idea, all are equal in the eyes of God and have equal inherent dignity and should be treated equally under the law, but equality in the sense of sameness. And the sameness premise is the problem. He does talk about some commentary from Thomas Sowell, and then he talks about how they go after the black pulpit, and admits that they're rife with Marxist liberation theology, CRT, intersectionality, and the social gospel. And he says, but with as many churches as we have in this large a country, that's no surprise. He said, but if you think that means those black churches don't address personal responsibility, you're wrong. And he indicates that, there are white liberals, Robin DiAngelo, Jim Wallace, and Daniel Hill, that chafe at the whole idea of black responsibility, but black pastors do not. And he talks about how that's all over the internet, right? The black pastors are trying to rein in, I guess, what they feel are excesses or bad behavior. I'm not going to reference that because while he gives a few examples, we have carrying on. Then he gets to the importance of fathers. And he said there was a speech delivered at Morehouse Conference on African American fathers 2 decades ago, and William Raspberry said, "Are black fathers necessary? I'm old and I'm tired, and there's some things I just don't want to debate anymore, and one of them is whether African American children need fathers, and whether marriage matters. Does marriage matter? And you bet it does, and are black fathers necessary? Damn straight we are." Now, that is a direct quote from Mr. William Raspberry. I guess it would have been right around 2000. And this is at Morehouse, which is a historically black college. And he's basically saying, yeah. Now, while my white brethren liberals out there, they might chafe at that. They might get upset by that. Voddie says here, this is not a white supremacist speaking at some kind of alt-right rally. This is a black man speaking at Morehouse. So they are aware of their own issues. They are working on their own issues in their own way. And perhaps my liberal brethren ought to let them handle their own house, would be my 2 cents on that matter. Then he talks about education and high standards. He references a speech Obama gave. And rather than quote the speech or reference the speech directly, I would say, go look them up from when he was a senator, when he was talking to a black audience, and see what he had to say. Same thing about crime. And a little bit later on, in this same chapter, right, he references feeding the victim mentality. And he talks about the false claim of police hunting and killing unarmed black men. And then there's a second one that says white people are hunting and killing unarmed black men. Talks about how the BLM movement started to gain traction and prominence after the Michael Brown case, but actually goes back to Trayvon Martin. And talks about how perhaps if we understood what was going on there, we would be able to better understand what the underlying motivations are and what exactly they're trying to get out of the push that they're doing. So that is, coming towards the end of this chapter here. And he spends a lot of time referencing it and giving lots of good footnotes. And then he talks about a history of accountability and action and the cries about over-policing of black communities and defunding. And he said, but these are inconsistent with facts on the ground. And that most black Americans, 81%, want the police to spend more time in their neighborhoods. And he said that resonates with his own experience. And he said that, sure, we feared the cops, but we feared the drug dealers more. Just a thought. And as a semi-suburban white man that grew up in the semi-suburban area, now I'm in a full-on suburban area, we never wanted to cross paths with the police, but we really didn't have much else to worry about in our town. But if I was in a part of town where we had lots of worries, probably lesser of two evils, you'd want the police around. Just saying. And then he gives lots more examples and understanding. I'm going to go through those. And then he talks about abortion and the unspoken epidemic in black America. And he talks about, the real problem or the real cause of death within the black community. It's abortion. And if I remember my statistic correctly, a black woman is 3 times more likely to abort her child than a white woman. And he references this Kermit Gosnell. Talks about how it's a shame and he's the least known serial killer. Now again, this goes back to what are they teaching us in the media? What is their story? What is the current narrative of the day? We don't want to talk about this. We don't want to admit that this is the case. We don't want to acknowledge that this is what's at play. Now, I know I've mentioned this in the past, but I'm not a black professor that runs a college and currently lives in Africa. Well, actually, I think he's back in the States at the moment. But when this guy says, Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger started what became as the Negro Project in order to reduce black population through birth control. It was a Malthusian eugenist who believed black and brown people were inherently inferior, and her first achievement among the black community came in 1923 when she opened a clinic in Harlem where she hired African-American doctors, nurses, and an all-black advisory council to help her clients feel more at ease and more inclined to listen to her birth control propaganda. She also relied on the black clergy to advance her message. And that message is the accepted norm among the vast majority of the black population. 15.5 million black babies have been aborted since 1973. That is the leading cause of death among black Americans. While they are only 13% of the population, they account for 35% of all abortions. So roughly 3 times as many. And 80% of those Planned Parenthood clinics are in minority neighborhoods. Sanger's eugenics dream, or the black person or black people's penchant for self-destruction is the blame. That is his question. I don't have the answer to that. We're going to move on to chapter 9. It's called Aftershock. The idea of the aftershock sometimes could be as bad or worse than the immediate earthquake. And he says one of the unintended consequences, under the subtitle Strange Bedfellows, is the critical social justice movement as Christians adopt this underlying ideology, will not be able to avoid the damage that it creates. The fact that evangelicals think they can adopt the analysis of the contemporary critical race theory with respect to race and sex, but not with respect to sexuality, gender identity, and religion is naive at best. And yet, it's all over our churches, particularly white churches. What are they trying to sell us? Talks about all the issues, all the different things that are in play. Then he brings it down to all these things seem random and unrelated, but they all stem from the same critical worldview. You scratch the surface of each one of these issues that you'll find. Now we're going to go jump back. So you've got his list, I guess 37 issues. I'm not going to read them all. Just know that there's plenty of them. And some of them don't even look like they're at all related. But there's hegemony, which is a group of people who possess illegitimate power and create structures to maintain it. The oppressor-oppressed paradigm. That's where you have your hegemonic overlords, have systems in place to preserve their power and oppress the minority. The Gnostic priests, people who have an experience of oppression that gives them insight that is unavailable to their oppressors. And the enlightened saviors, the people from which these in the oppressor class are exempt from their participation in oppression and serve as representatives and saviors to the oppressed in order to shepherd them through to the revolutionary process of usurping the hegemony. I'm sorry, but that really scary thought. He references some other things here, just some creative connections that are made, and he does touch back on abortion. I'm going to skip it only because I think we've kind of covered it, and he does very good treatment of how that goes together, and I'm not going to be able to do it justice in the time that I have left here. So he says the current political parties offer a potpourri of different positions and many, many other topics, most of which, as we've noted, the Bible does not speak to directly. Now, he is referencing Tim Keller, which is interesting because Tim Keller gets referenced a lot, but Tim Keller appears in my mind to have sold himself out to this theory, this policy, and it makes him a little bit suspect at this point. And he says when it comes to taking political positions, voting, determining alliances, and political involvement, the Christian has liberty of conscience. The Christian cannot say to other Christians, no Christian can vote for this, or every Christian must vote for, unless you find a biblical command to that effect. And then he says, set aside, this is voting, thou shalt not kill is pretty clear. So the primary issue that Keller is addressing is abortion, yet the Democrat and Republican platforms are diametrically on different sides of that. And basically Tim Keller is saying that You can put other things in place, or other things are equally important. So he says that he can't make the decision, this Tim Keller. But Vody says this leads to a second issue. Keller's history and insight it gives to the motives on this matter. So he said Keller had no problem making clear, unambiguous, authoritative statements on the host of moral issues from the CRTI perspective, right? But he says you have to find a biblical command to that effect when Christians must conclude, I am the product of standing on the shoulders of the people to get through injustice. So basically saying he picks and chooses what he thinks is authoritative. And he says abortion's a complex web of political potpourri that requires nuance and wisdom, but white privilege, generational white guilt, and the need to repent is so clear that Keller has no problem saying you have to and you must. And he's going to reference David Platt going into this stuff as well. And, there's any number of pastors, and including one that's in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, who I'm not even going to mention that guy's name because I've been so disappointed with him lately. So Platt basically says, yes, abortion's abhorrent. That's clear in the Bible, but is that the only issue at stake in the election? Well, we in the right of center, we as Republicans, conservatives, Christians, we've often thought, well, maybe, just maybe, the reason the Republican Party refuses to actually solve this problem is because they know they'll lose voters. When they lose this issue, they have nothing to keep us around. That's a good point. And that actually does kind of play into what they're making this argument for, right? But until that's solved, until this number one issue has been addressed, everything else is a secondary issue. And I think that both the Democrats and the Republicans are well aware of that, and they keep playing us for it. They keep selling us on the idea that, well, next time we'll get it. Next time we'll do it. I'm going to now buzz through the end of this because basically he spends the rest of this chapter pointing out these evangelical leaders and the way that they have found ways around to adopt the CRTI and to basically give cover to voting for Democrats, give cover to supporting bad policies and what I'll just call flat-out theft, which is excessive taxation and abuse. And as a matter of fact, I've heard somebody refer to it as fractional slavery. There's something to consider. So I think that I'm just going to leave that alone for right now. He does talk a little bit about how most black folks don't care about abortion. It's not a primary issue for them, which is, I guess, something that he is not really happy about, but he understands that that's unfortunately the way things are right now. So trying to blitz through the end. He's given lots of examples and explaining a lot of this. And he does reference CRT and the DNC. Now, in my book, this is page 194 out of like 254 pages, of which I think the last 50 pages are appendixes. But in order to understand where I'm coming from, it might help to know a little bit more of his history, right? He made blog posts back in 2008 opposing Obama's presidential candidacy, including one called Barack Obama, a Wolf in Sheep's Clothing. And the day after the election, the people have spoken. Barack Hussein Obama has been elected the 44th President of the United States of America. The left-wing press is ecstatic. White guilt has been assuaged. Affirmative action has been vindicated, and socialist Europe loves us again. Now comes the rub. It ain't over. If you think that this means that America is a racist, it means to the America is a racist society crowd, you'll have to shut up. You got another thing coming. In fact, watch the press closely in the coming days. There will be concerted effort to press the opposite point. So think about it. Have we gotten better? Have we gotten any acknowledgement in the last 12 years? I think not. I think it's even worse. I think they're shoving it even further and faster down our throats than they did before. And he does talk about that. And then he talks about a lot of different things that happen in the DNC. And as I'm running close to the end of my time here, he does talk about how a lot of this stuff has infected the Democrat Party specifically. And it seems to be going towards the other way as well, right? The Republicans are starting to take this back. So then he said, now he's done talking about DNC, he transitions. I don't believe Republicans are beyond reproach. In fact, the same year I spoke out against Obama, I made waves with another article in which I chided evangelicals who condemned John McCain's character, then reversed themselves when he picked Sarah Palin as his running mate. And that, of course, put him on Fox News, where they expected him to wail on Republicans. And basically, he said they almost swallowed their tongues when he pointed out that Obama was the most radically pro-abortion candidate ever to run for president. He says the critical social justice movement is vast. Its influence is broad and deep within the evangelical circles, and it's growing. He does briefly talk about Trump in an executive order, and he does reference how, disappointed and offended by his behavior, but he does say he was grateful to God putting him where he was for the period of time he was there, and maybe he bought his time. I don't know. Now we're going to go to chapter 10 briefly. I know I'm really running hard on the time here issue. I'm sorry. Restoration and mitigation. So he says, my goal in this chapter is not to offer solution to America's or the church's racial injustice problem. There's quotes there. I don't believe we have one. I believe there's racism. I believe there are racists. However, I reject the idea that America is characterized by racism or that racism is an unavoidable byproduct of our national DNA. In fact, I believe America is one of the least racist countries in the world. Moreover, the preponderance of evidence shared by those promoting racial justice as a pressing need of the day is rooted either in the assumptions of CRT/I, which views every disparity as de facto evidence of racism, or emotional appeals to facts that are either complicate or completely disprove their own claims. And then he's going to take some time to share the example of the 3/5 human myth. Now, I'm very familiar with this from reading Chris Ann Hall, from reading and listening to her and Tom Woods for that matter. So I'm not even going to go over that. I'm just going to say that he does a very good treatment to it. Then he said, thousands have not bowed the knee. He said, quote Samuel, be of good courage, let us be courageous for our people. Many have not bowed the knee or have become woke to the dangers of wokeness. That is the beginning of the problems. And the question is always that, or he references this question that he always gets is, how do I help my church navigate this mess? The answer he wishes was easy, but he knows the fault line is shifting, and we've only begun to see the devastation. Churches are being split. More will succumb to the damages. Ministries are beginning to drift and will drift further away. Now, I could give you half a dozen examples of this, but that's not the purpose of this. The purpose of this is I want you to go read this book. He starts to tie up the end of the chapter, and he says, we are at war. He says, modern Christians are very uncomfortable with the idea of using war language. And perhaps it's because the 11th commandment, thou shalt be nice. But he also looks at it as being aggressive, confrontational, or masculine as being less than Christian. However, the Bible is replete with war language and actual war, and that language is appropriate because we are at war, but we cannot rely on ordinary tactics. For though we walk in flesh, we are not waging a war according to the flesh. The weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy the strongholds. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, take every thought captive to obey Christ, being ready to punish with every disobedience when your obedience is complete. And that's 2 Corinthians 10. So, this is a war against Christianity. We need to recognize it for what it is, and we need to fight back accordingly. But there is a proper way we fight, and that's the thing we need to always remember. He does talk about how the war of language is replete. He notes how Tisby and even Vischer get upset when you call them out by what they are, being Marxism, right? They want to destroy those labels. They want to take away what those mean because they know what that means. They know that's an adequate way to fight back. They know if they destroy it, they take that away. So he said, eventually it's going to be, instead of white and people of color, it's going to be Christian. You need to look at it from a Christian view, that they're coming after you. And the war is spiritual. So, one of the final sentences before he transitions into the war being spiritual is, if white people need to check their privilege, then Christians will soon be asked to do the same. Make no mistake about it. We are under attack. I think I'm not even going to talk about. Talks about the war being spiritual, the weapons being spiritual. I'm going to leave that alone. He says we fight with the truth of the gospel. We fight with the truth of biblical justice. We fight with the unity of the body, and our weapons are powerful. And we must destroy those arguments and speculations. Honestly, that's where I'm going to stop. I feel that I've given this enough treatment. There are a lot more things that he covers here. Basically talking about why Black Lives Matter is a fraud. The organization, not the statement, of course. And he finishes out the book basically telling us what we can do and how we can handle this, after he has reminded us that the war is not of the flesh. And these are some things that can be done. And then he talks in chapter 11 about solid ground. Now, again, I am going to just stop now. I want you to take what I did and look at it as what I intended it to be, which is a review of the 11 chapters. I left out almost all of chapter 11 because that's where he really talks about what can be done and how we should handle this. And I don't want to do him a disservice. I don't want to do you a disservice. You really need to read the entirety of the book. And then when you get to the end, there's about 20 so pages of appendices that talk about the Dallas Statement. And I'm trying to remember what the other one is off the top of my head. I apologize. I think it was... the original resolution on critical race theory and intersexuality, which was number 9. And then, of course, he's got on there what they warped it into. So, whether or not you're a Baptist, whether or not you're Reformed, if you call yourself a Christian, if you are involved in what we would call an evangelical church, it is in your best interest to read this book, to have an understanding of what's going on, and to be prepared to counter it and be prepared to do battle. Many of my acquaintances and people that I would like to call friend buy into this stuff. And I think their motivation especially initially, was righteous. They had a solid purpose for it. But now that they're in, they're trying to take the pieces out of it that they think are good without realizing it's a package deal. And that's the danger. We've let the camel's nose underneath the tent. We've let the wolf in with the sheep. And we now need to deal with it. Well, that, my friends, is the wrap-up of Fault Lines. I hope you've enjoyed it. I found it to be an excellent book. Filled in a lot of gaps in my knowledge, and I feel much better off having read it. And I have definitely a better understanding of what's at play with the critical race theory and intersectionality, and how that stuff is all being used to manipulate Christians. That is my Theology Thursday, if you will, episode. I am recording a little early, but I'm going to put it out on Thursday like I normally would. But I finished the book over the weekend, and I wanted to do as much of this while it was still fresh in my mind. Thank you. Good night.